Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. I'm National Master Dave Mohan, and as I hope you guys can notice, the audio quality might be a little bit better. I did invest in a microphone. I said that once we got to 250 subscribers, I was going to do something to try and improve the audio quality, and the channel's been going really well. So thank you guys for subscribing, and if you haven't yet, please do. It helps me out a lot. We're trying to get to that glorious 1K number. That's our first milestone. All right, so we are back with another subscriber game analysis video, and let's just start things off. I'm doing it a little differently this time. I picked the top 6 most instructive games, in my opinion, and I didn't pick games that were already heavily analyzed. So there were some incredible games that were submitted, but it seemed like there was already a ton of analysis and there's not much value that I could add there. So I picked the games in which I could add the most value, in which I believe I can provide the most analysis that will be helpful. So let's jump right in. The first game we're going to look at was submitted by Jack Urakawa, and it's a great instructive game, and also he is one of my most loyal Twitch followers, so gotta show some love, and I think everyone can learn a lot from this game. So his opponent starts with knight to c3, a little bit odd. I think Alexander Morozevich used to play this, but e5 is a principled response. Okay, knight f3, knight c6, e4, so we just basically have a 4 knights, except Jack doesn't develop the 4th knight here. Bishop b4, take the knight on c3. This all looks good. Knight f6, queen to d3. Queen d3 seems a little bit odd. d5 seems like a pretty good way to punish this move. Takes, and pawn to c4. So trying to trade off the queens. And here, Jack Urakawa played knight to f4. I think, although knight f4 is aggressive, I think knight to f6 might be a little bit better in this specific position. So after pawn to c4, if you go knight to f6, now after this trade, you can take back with your king, and you have a slightly more comfortable position than the alternative if you go knight f4 and white takes your queen. Because now if you take back with your knight, your pawn on e5 gets captured, so you must take back with your king, and now white gets a quick initiative. Bishop takes f4, e takes f4, and castles queenside, and white's going to start causing some problems here. But after knight to f4, white plays bishop takes, pawn takes, and g3. This seems a little strange to me, not getting castled. White's not prioritizing castling. So queen e7 check is a good way to take advantage of this. Bishop b2, castles. This is good. And now g takes f4. That's a bold move. White is winning that pawn, but it's not a good pawn to capture. In fact, it's almost poisoned. That's how bad it is to capture this pawn. Now, here bishop to h3 was played, but white isn't really trying to castle kingside anyways. White wants to go queenside. So I think this is a good opportunity for white to just castle queenside and say, I think I'm getting out of this, because if you go rook to d8, there is stuff like queen to e3, and white's problems in the center, especially with his king, seem to be solved. So instead of bishop to h3, I would consider just going rook to e8. And now if white castles, we can take this bishop on e2. And we're not getting into any back rank problems really, because takes, there's no rook to d8 because we take it with the knight. So yeah, it is also important though to watch out for some tactics. Maybe queen takes e2. I'm just noticing there is a rook to e1 tactic, so that would not be very good. Just caught myself there. So yeah, rook to e8 still seems like it could be good. I know also queen to f6 comes to mind, just a double attack between these two pawns and getting ready to play bishop out to f5. So this looks like it could be pretty promising. Queen to f6. But bishop h3, white doesn't want to go kingside anyways. Knight d4, rook d8. So here, this is another position in which white has a little bit of a tactic. So white can actually take this knight. And if you take the queen, he takes your queen as an in-between move and then takes your rook. And now you're really in trouble because you're down a rook and a piece. And if after knight takes c6, you just recapture with your pawn, then he can just take your bishop over here. So a little bit of a tactic there. You could just take this knight on d4 and still have a lot of pressure here. If you just take the knight on d4, takes back, and we have stuff like bishop to g4, rook coming to e8. This bishop is just going to be lost on e2. So all right. Instead, you played rook d8. Your opponent takes your bishop. You take with the knight. Queen to d3. Okay, rook e8, and yeah, now you're just winning this bishop, and you went on to win the queen. So good game there. Yeah, your opponent just resigned here. Yeah, this was a good game. There were a couple tactics to watch out for, and in the position where you played bishop to h3, just be very conscious of what your threats are. You know, whether you're actually stopping your opponent from doing something that he wants to do. All right, so let's move on to the next game. The next game we have here is between Mi Amigo and Chess Player 2093. Now, this is a huge rating disparity here. Mi Amigo, who submitted the game, is 1662, and his opponent is 2313. So big rating disparity. Let's see what happened here. Knight f3, knight f6, c4. So we have it could be a Reti, but also in English in some cases. Okay, bishop b7, e3. This is a pretty normal opening. I used to play this with white with b3. Or it's still part of my repertoire, rather. And now d4. I like this position. I'm sort of skimming over the opening because it's pretty basic stuff. Castle c5. So a lot of the time in this position, white will accept the hanging pawn structure. So from my experience here, the best place to put your pieces are queen to e2, rook fd1, and rook ac1. This is sort of the ideal setup. So rook e1 here is all right, but if you're trying to go for this e4 idea, the queen on e2 is much more effective in doing so, and your rooks will be better on d1 and c1, especially if your hanging pawns are the C and D pawns. So if your hanging pawns are the C and D pawns, you want your rooks to be on the C and D files so that they can support these pawns and support some pawn breaks in the center if that ends up happening. So here you played rook to e1 and pawn to e4. So in open dynamic position, your opponent recaptured, takes, lots of captures in the center. Now, possibly in some endgames, you can utilize the c6 square. Your bishop is also pretty good on this diagonal. So this pawn is captured, and you go rook back to e1. So this move is a little bit surprising to me because I'm not seeing what's wrong with rook takes d4. So rook takes d4, and it's impossible for black to stop this threat of rook takes d7. So it looks like this rook takes d4 move would just have been winning because your opponent is pinned so badly. So this would have been something to watch out for. Usually when your opponent's pieces are cramped like this and your pieces are so active, you can find these opportunities to get these tactics. You know, tactics are most available in positions where your pieces are better placed. But okay, you go rook back to e1, and now bishop to f6, takes, so we get some more exchanges, knight to c5, rook d1. Okay, this is all very normal. I don't see an issue with any of these moves that have been played. Takes. So we're sort of skimming through this as there's nothing really wrong. Knight to e5 is a good move. I might also consider knight to d4, knight to b5, just because this b5 square is so weak. But your knight e5 move is also strong, so I can't complain about that. Now, king to f1, all right. Yeah, this is good, king f1. And you drop back. All right, the king comes out to e2, knight to d3. All right. Yeah, just trading off the knights, but your opponent declines. Good job not falling for this knight fork right here, knight c3. Just bring your king up. This is a good move. And rook to d2, protecting the pawn on a2. So this is all very good. You've played incredibly well. Definitely quite a bit above the 1662 rating. Here now a3, knight to d1 check. You come back, knight c3 check back, king e3. Now knight to d5. Okay, so your opponent is being a little bit tricky. Now here you should probably, if your opponent keeps doing these tactics against the rook, like for example right here, knight to d1, was it possible, I wonder if it was possible to play king to d2, trying to trap in the knight somehow. But actually, it looks like your opponent has this saving grace, rook to d8, this counter tactic. Now, if you take his knight, he takes yours, and is actually doing very well here. Oh, that was a bit of a mouse slip. Yeah, take on d3. Okay, so the way you played this was fine. King e2, knight d5, but now you should go back to d2. Now coming back to d2 means that you're winning this b pawn, because king d2, your rook is now protected, so you are threatening to take this knight. And if the knight tries to jump back to c3, now b4 falls. So this would have been something good to keep in mind. After king to e2, however, as was played in the game, your opponent played knight to c7, but I'm wondering if there's an opportunity now to just grab this a pawn. Because there's no threat of c takes d5 as your rook hangs. So for example, takes, we can't take this knight because of the pressure on this pin. And if we go rook to a2, we're falling into a little tactic, knight to c3. So your opponent had an opportunity here to take the pawn, but he didn't. He goes knight c7, and now you're winning a pawn. King to e8, rook to d8, rook b8, all good. And now you played knight d3, so you should go more active here. In this position, you can play the move knight to c6. And if you're attacking your opponent's rook, if he takes this one, now you give a check. The king comes up, you check again, and now you win the knight because there's this nasty fork. So this would have been a good tactical idea to keep in mind. Just bring the knight more into the position. Knight c6 is a move that you should be looking for in this type of position, as you get to keep your pawns, and your knight gets a really good square here on c6. But let's see what happened. So now it's just an equal ending. All right, g4, interesting move. I don't like to be so committal with my pawns. Leaving them on f3, g2, and h2 should be completely good as well. There's no need to commit too much with these ones. But this h5 idea is interesting. Takes, and now your opponent trades the knights, okay? And you play f4, so you're just trying to liquidate. And now king to f5. Rook to b8 by your opponent seems a bit too passive. I think he should stay active with his rook. Maybe come over here, rook h3. Or maybe rook b4. But stay active is the main thing here. But rook b8, now you take this. And rook to e5, good move. Yeah, and you're trying to scoop up this pawn, all right. King there, rook to g6. Okay, king h8. Now you advance your pawn. Rook g7 check. All right, this all looks normal. And all right, here, trying to trade off, but yeah, this is just a draw. So well played game by both sides. Good job to mi amigo for holding this position against someone significantly higher rated. That can be very tough to do. All right, so let's move on to the next game. Here we have a game between Zach Cancio and Nico Chasen. So Zach, who submitted the game, is playing the white pieces, and his opponent is rated about 230 points higher than him. but he was able to get this win at nationals no less. So very important game, and he was able to pull out a win here. So let's see what happened. We have a Sicilian, and Zach goes for the open Sicilian, and we see a Taimanov variation from Nico. So I've actually played the Taimanov variation against Zach, so he must have used our game as inspiration for what he did here. All right, but he goes G3 this time. In our game, he played Bishop E3. Guess he must have learned his lesson. Bishop G2, Knight F6. Yeah, this all looks very normal. Takes. Yeah, taking with the D pawn. It's generally said that you should capture towards the center, but in this case, taking with the D pawn is all right. It's justifiable because you can try to play E5. It's an idea in these E6 Sicilians. So Bishop F4. Bishop F4 sort of encourages this E5, which I feel Black wanted to play anyways. So if Black wants to go E5 anyways, we should probably not encourage it. One move that comes to mind here is Bishop to G5, threatening to ruin Black's kingside pawn structure. That's one thing I would consider. Another thing I might consider is possibly going Queen E2. Maybe something slow with H3, King H2, pawn to F4. You know, one of those classic kingside attacking ideas where you're trying to get this F4 break. But Bishop F4, E5, and now Bishop G5. All right, so pawn to H5. Nico really trying to go for it here on the king side, noticing that there might be some potential for H4. This move does strike me as a bit odd. Knight A4, okay, and queen to D2. I'm not sure the bishop is doing so much more on C5 than it is on A7. So I'm not sure if this knight A4 move is necessary. Your knight isn't doing so much on C3, so it's understandable why you want to play knight to A4. But I think this bishop is happy on A7. Queen to D2, all right, and B5 is played. Now bishop to E6. Okay, so bishop G4, taking advantage of the fact that white cannot play F3 because this bishop on A7 guards the whole diagonal. So takes, and now queen to D6, a dynamic way to try to get this queen trade and not lose an exchange. So takes, and now rook to C8, guarding the C pawn. And I did take a look at this game before making the video. So I do know that this bishop D4 idea is very tricky, trapping the rook. So if one hadn't seen that, I can totally see why this rook on D6 would seem safe. Bishop D4 is just a very interesting idea to try and trap it. So after H3, bishop E6, rook D1, this bishop D4 idea was played, and now black has created quite an advantage for himself with his play. So knight to D5, sort of a last-ditch effort to try and save this rook. Very interesting idea. So bishop C5. Knight to D5. I'm still sort of confused by knight D5. So what happens if black takes this? What's white's plan here? I'm not really sure. Maybe the plan is to recapture and then black plays the bishop somewhere. Let's say bishop to D7. And white's idea might be just trying to scoop up pawns. So pawn to C3 and just trying to take pawns, rook takes A6, and try to prove some sort of compensation here. But actually in the game, black doesn't take the knight. He goes bishop to C5, which gives away the entire advantage. And now white is actually quite a bit better after this knight C7 trick. And this is a really good spot by white here. So Zach did a great job spotting this. And rook takes C6. All right, bishop A7. Now we have knight D5. So black has really thrown away the advantage here. But white has done a good job finding these only moves. So we get this opposite color bishop's position where white has a queenside majority. Pawn to D6 is played. And now rook takes a6. More pawns are being scooped up here. h4, interesting. So I guess white didn't want to allow h4 from black and is trying to play bishop to h3 himself. So bishop at h3 gets played. Now, okay. Here he takes the rook. Yeah, there's also bishop takes f5 intermediately, but I'm not sure how much it matters really, because takes, bishop takes f5 is played anyways. Bishop b2 and d7. Now this d pawn is an absolute monster. Bishop d4 and rook to d3, okay. Consolidating a3. This is a good move, getting rid of the b pawn for the a pawn. As with the pawn on b4, both the c pawn and the a pawn are backwards. So a3 is a strong move. And this bishop on f5, it's going to be really hard to dislodge this. White is just completely winning here. So king e7, and now, okay, g4. G4 I wouldn't have played, but it is a good move. You know, it's just a matter of style, I guess. I would have just preferred to play bishop back to h3, sort of not allow anything here. But g4 is good as well. So takes, king comes back. King g3, king f3. All right, black's trying to get something going here. Wins a pawn. Okay, this all seems pretty normal. Now it's just a race, I guess. Black has the passed e pawn. And f5. Okay, so black really going for it here. He wants the win. So this bishop on h4 now protects the promotion square. And rook c8. Okay, bishop comes back to d3. Takes. And I believe, yeah, it was in after a couple moves. Okay, rook to d4. Yeah, it was in this position that that Zach left the comment that rook to f8 was possibly the best move that he has played in his life, and with good reason too. It's an amazing move. It might in fact be the only move to win. Otherwise, black has some serious threats of taking on d3 and promoting into a queen. But after rook to f8, if black does this, takes, and queens, now white queens, and this pin on the queen is absolutely brutal and game ending. Because after bishop takes queen, rook takes queen, and this is all but over. So really good spot by Zach here, this rook to f8. Bishop h4 and h6. Now white is just promoting the h-pawn, and after king a3, we see a resignation because black has nothing left to play for. This h-pawn promotion is incredibly tough to stop. Actually impossible. So good game by Zach here. Let's move on to the next one. We see Bent Sicilian versus Self-Aware. And if you guys see me going fast through a couple portions of the game, it's because all the moves are natural. I don't have too much more value to add to certain aspects of the game, but there are certain aspects where I can give my input. So e4 g6, we see a modern defense. And here is another huge rating disparity. Bent Sicilian sitting at about 1300 and Self-Aware, his opponent, sitting at about 2000. So we get this, I'm forgetting what this is called at the moment. But yeah, I've seen this opening before. It's interesting with a6 b5. The name will come to me. So knight to d7, this is how black commonly plays. And in these sorts of positions, I feel like I remember black commonly plays h6 instead of h5, because this is a common idea to meet h5 with g5. But after h5, white tries to take advantage of this with the move g4. Now I start to wonder if g4 is a weakness or a strength. So after takes, is there this knight to f6? And this is a double attack against both of these guys right here. There might be some sort of queen to g2 to protect both of these weaknesses. So white might be hanging on to the pawns here, but it just feels as though black has achieved something. Maybe e5 here. It feels as though black has really doesn't have to worry too much about the kingside pressure in this position, and the queen on g2 is just sitting there a bit strangely. But the white position is still totally playable. So g4 is not a bad move. But black didn't capture. Instead, black played this knight to f6, and after g5 has to come all the way back to g8. Now, since the knight has no future on g8, I can't help but wonder whether knight h7 might be a better trying to one day come over to the e6 square. But knight g8, you can come out to e7. It's just not that happy on e7 either. So f4, c5, okay, black trying to open up the position. But Sicilian playing well, knight to f3, b4, and black tries to scoop up this e-pawn. All right, takes, and we see a capture, lots of captures, good. A queen takes, and a5. So now white should try to come up with some sort of concrete way to try and start proving the advantage. So one move that comes to mind here for me is this knight to e5. This is a very straightforward way of saying, okay, I want to trade your only good developed piece for my bishop on g2. My knight on e5 is very good in the center. And if you ever go knight e7, worst case, I can take it and I have a solid position. So if you take my knight on e5, now I take with the f-pawn, and this e-pawn is great. This f-pawn practically doesn't exist because how is it ever going to come up? There will always be either a capture or en passant. So yeah, this is a tough position for black for sure. But bishop to d4 also all right. I'm not sure if it's as good because black's bishop on g7 is sort of blunted after knight to e5. But let's see what happened. Takes, and now bishop d5, king to b1. Okay, since it is an ending, you don't really want your king to be on the side of the board. I think if you even go like rook to e1 here, you shouldn't be concerned about bishop takes because there is this Bobby Fischer idea. Actually, he was victim to this. After taking a pawn, you can go b3, and now your idea is king b2, trapping the bishop. So okay, king b1, let's see what happened, knight e7, and now this knight is threatening to come to this amazing f5 square. And this is sort of a dream position for black that he was able to achieve this after such a poor opening and middle game. So yeah, just keep that knight e5 idea in mind. Okay, now he gets this position in which he's winning some material, and after this fork, it's a tough position, but I actually scanned through the game beforehand, obviously, and it's amazing the comeback that Sicilian was able to make. So let's skip forward a bit. King e3, rook d1, and I really want to skip to this critical moment where this knight becomes a beast. So one of the reasons I picked this game is because it's a good example that you should never give up. So even when the position looks quite desperate, like here, black has a 9 or 10 point advantage just because of this passed h-pawn, and he's up in exchange. But Sicilian was able to come back. So we see rook e1 takes, promote, and this tricky rook to e1 move. And black is not forced to react to this rook e1. Black can just keep the queen on the board. Now, there could be other tricks, like, for example, queen to g2. You're falling to the same trick with rook g1, but black is still winning this. Black takes and falls for the fork, knight to f3. Knight d3, and Sicilian basically just wants to grab all the pawns on the queen side. Black can stop this, so rook to h5 stops white from picking up all the pawns. And you're still trying to promote your g-pawn, so there's nothing wrong with that, but instead he decides to give up all his pawns, and after knight d3 check, the simple move king to f1 stops everything, but black plays king e2, falling for another fork. So this knight has really been a savior for the white position. So takes, and now a4. Yeah, so this position, black is slightly better, but you definitely have chances. The one thing I would make sure here is that the black king doesn't get too involved. So a5, this is already a bit of a blunder because now it's going to be tough to advance all your pawns. If I were white here, I'm not sure of the objective evaluation, but I would play c4. And the idea is to keep all the pawns together. A4, B4, and C4, these guys are triplets. They're trying to come up the board together. And if you find an opportunity to advance them together, that's your only chance of winning. So A5, King D5, and yeah, we see the black king coming to the rescue here. And yeah, B5 allows King C5. So again, being very careful with these pawn pushes. Again, I'd wait here, maybe King A6, King C3, but it is tough to press this or hold this with white. So okay, we reach this position in which there is a total blockade. You are getting some more chances though, actually. This is shocking that you're able to get in this C5 move, because here black should not be retreating the king. Black should be playing stuff like Rook A8. Just trying to get a win here. And after Rook A8, actually white still does have good play. Wow, this is actually fascinating. So it's not so easy. King B4, King B7 is a blunder. Yeah, this is really interesting. So I guess the idea is try to force the king to do something. Maybe Rook to H8 is the move. And now if pawn to C5, we give this check. The king is forced to step back and we take this pawn. And yeah, this is now black is winning. You can take this. If B7, we have Rook to B4. So yeah, this is what black had to find. And actually at first I didn't even see it. So it is a tough move to find. Now C5 and white has a draw. C6. C7, okay. King to A4. I think maybe you should try to bring your king here, King C5, and use your king to support these promotion threats. So if you can get King D6, King D7 in, this is a great opportunity to create a draw here. But instead King to A4, which is a bit abnormal, but you come back to B4 and you bring your king up, okay. King B5, okay, A6, and A7. And this is still supposed to be a drawn position. But okay, let's see what happened. So he takes. Okay. So this is the problem here, this King to B5 move, because you're allowing black to take the pawn with a check. So for example, if you play King to A5 and black takes, now you're actually winning this because you promote, takes, and you promote again. So this would have been winning. But yeah, King B5 allowing the check is just too much because now your pawns get picked up. The more precise way to do this is just Rook C6 check and take the pawn. But this works just as well. You're winning everything. So yeah, your opponent was able to convert this. He's a 2000 rated player, pretty strong, so he was able to do this. But it's amazing to me that you had chances the whole game. Your opponent kept allowing you chances, and you took pretty much all of them, even down to the last couple moves. So great job there. I have to commend your play. All right, next game is between High Deer and Scorpio 789. And Scorpio was the one who submitted this game. So E4, knight to C6. Bishop B5. This is very strange. This knight C6 is called the Nimzovich defense. And white's most popular move is pawn to D4 here, just taking more space in the center. There's also knight to F3, knight C3. But After bishop b5, black just develops the other knight and is claiming everything's okay. Taking towards the center and going e5. This all looks perfect. Pawn to d6. Okay, good. Bishop e6. All right. This bishop e6 move is fine. I'm not so certain if this is the best square for it. It could be. It very well could be, but you're always risking that there's knight g5 getting a tempo on your bishop, and that at some point d4, d5 might be a problem for you. So bishop e6, I'd probably just play bishop e7 and castle. And maybe your bishop actually is happier on a6, this square right here, where it has pressure on the d3 pawn. So bishop e6 is fine though, and you play d5. So d5, it's too early for this. You have to get castle, you have to protect the e5 pawn before you play a move like d5 because of exactly what happens in the game. Takes, and your center pawn gets taken. And this e5 pawn is not particularly one that you're so happy to give up. But you do have compensation, I will admit that. After d5, there is compensation in the position. Maybe white should actually take on e5 right away. That way you're threatening this, and you haven't committed to a capture in the center. So, yeah, I think that this d5 pawn sack might not be so accurate. But takes, you do get some compensation for it. Queen d6. Instead of queen d6, I'd probably try and get my bishop out. Bishop to d6. That way I'm ready to castle. So queen d6 does attack the knight, but bishop d6 does the same thing, and we're ready to castle. So keep those sorts of ideas in mind. But queen d6, there's d4, bishop e7, bishop to g5. If I were white here, I would play bishop b4 or bishop f4. Be very straightforward and say, I'm attacking your queen indirectly, so I have some tactics along this diagonal. For example, knight g6 is a common tactic, getting out of the way, protecting the bishop, and attacking the rook at the same time as attacking this queen. So very powerful threats here. But white plays bishop g5. This move isn't as good. You castle, good job. And yeah, I don't like bishop c8. The idea here is pretty clearly to swing around and reposition the bishop to the king side. So bishop a6 is the intent. But the bishop on a6, oops, my arrows are crazy today, is not guaranteeing a win of material. For example, bishop a6, there's always knight to d3. And I agree that this knight is not looking good on d3 and it's in a pin, but you can do better things with this tempo that you have. For example, rook to b8, attacking b2. This does much more for your advantage than moving the bishop all the way back to c8. But white castles, and now you play rook to e8, h5, trying to get something going. And this was the moment in which you played a move that's actually quite incredible. It wouldn't cross a lot of players' minds as the first move, but actually I would encourage everyone to pause the video and think of what sort of plan they would come up with here, especially to continue the attack, because I think the try by black here is actually very interesting. Black plays queen to a3, and this is actually, in my opinion, the best move, because after takes, which is the most critical variation, because anything else you're threatening both mate and taking the a2 pawn, so taking the queen seems to be the most critical. Now bishop takes, king comes up, and bishop f5. And now this is just indefensible. Knight e4, check on b2, very important to throw in. Now take on e4, and knight to d5 is mate. So I wanted to show this game because there were some good learning opportunities earlier on, but also this queen a3 idea is just absolutely beautiful. So great job to Scorpio 789. This is a beautiful game. And there is some stuff to learn from the earlier opening, stuff that you could improve on, but you did win this nicely. All right, now for the sixth and the last game. I told you guys this week I'll be analyzing 6 of your games, the top 6 most instructive, and this is number 6. So we have a game between Hakem 50-40 and Skim Milk. These players are both around the 1500 level, and Skim Milk is playing with the black pieces. So we see a sort of neo-Catalan, or maybe pseudo-Catalan is better, where white is trying to develop the bishop to g2 after playing d4. The normal Catalan involves d4, c4, knight f3, and g3. But this is a bit different because white hasn't committed to c4. And actually in these positions, when white doesn't play c4, it's not uncommon to see black play b5. So for example, after knight to f3, this move is not totally out of the question. And it actually makes a ton of sense because you're stopping c4. And if white ever plays a4, you just push forward with b4. And you're ready to play a5, knight d7, e6, and you have a pretty comfortable position here. So keep that in mind. When your opponent plays the Catalan without c4, you can play this b5 move. Instead, you play e6 and bishop d6. Okay, this isn't such a huge thing, but usually against these g3 setups, the bishop on d6 is not very effective. It's sort of hitting against a wall here, the g3 and h2 pawns. So bishop e7 is slightly better. Also, it stops any future pins. But let's see what happened. So now white has developed the bishop to b2, which is why I would say that the next move that you played is not in the spirit of the position. First, let me start by suggesting what I would go for. I would play h6 here. Now, anytime white plays knight to h4, I come back with my bishop to h7, and I'm keeping this very strong bishop. My secondary idea is after knight to d2, which is presumably white's next move, we go c6, because our pawn belongs on this solid square, and we start pushing on the queen side with a5. And if we can get in a5, a4, a3, this pawn is actually a thorn in white's side if it gets to a3, because in a lot of endgames, let me just show a sample position like this. In a lot of endgames, this is thinking far into the future, but I have talked about this. I think I may have only talked about this on my Twitch stream, but in some endgames, you can sack a piece on b3 and promote your pawn in 2 moves. So that's thinking far into the future, but it is a real possibility. Also, if you can ever win the a2 pawn in some sort of rook ending, swing your rook around. And this is thinking way into the future, but your a pawn is ready to promote. So this is what I would go for here, but this c5 move that you played really helps white a lot because after dc5, bishop c5, this bishop goes from a bad piece to an incredible one because it has this diagonal to work with. So knight d2, now h6, okay? And you accept this Isolani position, and this is about equal. Black has compensation for the isolated pawn because his pieces are super active. a3, a5, all good. Knight e5, takes, rook to c8. This all looks good to me. Queen d7 is an error in my opinion because we don't want to allow this bishop takes on f6 because we don't want these doubled pawns. These doubled pawns, now we have an isolated pawn here, double isolated pawns here, and an isolated pawn here. So we are definitely worse with black in this position. And I would even consider playing like e4 with white here just to break it open, but e3 is also very good. Yeah, I don't like this decision. There are a couple things that you could consider instead. I think this knight e4 move is very natural. Just bringing a knight into the center, and you're actually trying to get rid of your isolated pawn. So let's say a position arises like this. All these trades occur. Now you don't have an isolated pawn, and I would argue you're actually slightly better. You're the one who's pushing here. You have queen b6. Your bishop is great on c5. This b3 pawn is weak. You have e3 threats. So you're slightly better in this position. So knight e4 is the move to look out for. Just trying to get rid of your isolated position and play in the spirit of the Isolani position. I'm not sure how often you get this isolated queenside pawn IQP position, but you do want to play actively whenever you have it. So this queen d7 move is not in the spirit of the position. And now queen h5 is a good move by your opponent to try and convert. Okay, queen h4. Your opponent is putting the pieces on the right side of the board. And this knight d4 move is strong. Just cementing the knight on an incredible square. Queen to f4. Okay, so you trade the a pawn for this f6 pawn. And that's a good trade for you if you're playing the black pieces, because you have these double isolated f pawns that are of no use to you anyways. And if you can take the a pawn, you can create a pass pawn and an ending with some sort of a4 move. So I like this. And rook to c5, okay. So you try to repeat, but your opponent wants none of it, and you lose the a pawn. So is there a way that we can avoid this? Maybe in this position right here, maybe you can look to protect the a pawn, rook to a8, and try to go a4. This would be my suggestion instead of trying to trade to the queens or create a repetition. But if you do want to put pressure on this queen, then it might have to wait a little bit. So bishop e7, and now you lose the a pawn. But let's see what happens. Takes. Now we get this ending down a bunch of pawns. And let's see if white converted this well. Apparently not, because there was the bishop to d3 trick. This is very interesting. So you're threatening to pick up the knight. Is there anything that white can do against this? I'm trying to understand what exactly the computer wants in this position. Maybe knight to d4 is the move, and white's just basically saying that if you take my exchange, I'm still better because I have 3 pawns and a knight for the rook, and it's going to be hard for you to play against these 2 minor pieces. So this might be white's idea here, but bishop d3 is a good fighting move. And now a lot of white's advantage is gone because you have this piece for the 4 pawns. And it's still tough, but let's see if you had any opportunities here. Okay, bishop g7. All right, so yeah, this is normal. And you try to work your bishop around and pick up another pawn. All right, bishop b4. Let's see what ended up happening. You do pick up this other pawn. Okay, so now it's bishop for 3 pawns. And you try to bring your king over. Okay, so this is a mistake in my opinion. Keep your king on the king side. There's really nothing happening on the queen side. There's no action over there. And if you do successfully bring your king all the way over here, your opponent's rook just swings over. So leave your king on the king side and try to defend over there. The other thing is it might be beneficial for you to hold this to maybe keep the rooks on the board. So let's see what happens. Your opponent gets this 4th pawn, which is not something you want to allow. If you find yourself in a position where you are having to give up material, try to start creating some more concrete threats for your opponent, like rook to b2, targeting this f2 pawn. Now you're hoping maybe bishop e1, a possible bishop c5 in the future, will start mounting more pressure on this f2 pawn. So start creating more concrete threats, but king c6 just gives your opponent the pawn with tempo. And now let's see how he converts this. g4, okay, and it looks like white won here. Not sure if it was by resignation or by flag. You still have some chances here, so if you did resign here, I would argue that that's not in your best interest, and you might even be able to trick your opponent in some positions. Let's say he's too concentrated on promoting. Bishop e5, h5. Now you even have this rook to h2 mate. So I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but if you have a bishop for 4 pawns, you can easily reach a position that's drawable, even if it involves giving up your bishop for 2 or 3 of the pawns. Because some of these positions, like rook, f pawn, and h pawn versus just the rook, it's a draw. So if you can figure out some way to give up your bishop effectively. But overall, this was a good game. I was I was impressed by your play, especially earlier on. Is at the 1400 level. I think you played some good moves. Just keep in mind some of the ideas I talked about with this b5 early on, and also just keeping your bishop on e7 instead of d6 against these structures. And then finally not playing c5 and opening up your opponent's diagonals for him. So that was pretty much it. That rounds it out for this subscriber game analysis video. If you guys have any suggestions for future videos, please feel free to comment that. I'm always looking for suggestions. I am trying to get a webcam to improve the video quality. So if you would like to support the channel and help me get a webcam, I have my Venmo right here. And if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe. We're trying to get to 1K subscribers, so every subscription helps a lot. It was a pleasure to analyze all of your games, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.